Red Podcast, episode 246, part 2 of my book launch trilogy with Jeff Sanders.
This is the Red Podcast. Here's your host, David Hooper.
David Hooper, Red Podcast, the podcast for experts. If you're a blogger, podcaster, author, speaker, somebody with a message to spread, you're in the right place. This is the podcast for you. And this is part 2 of a trilogy that I'm doing with Jeff Sanders. The first one, if you haven't checked it out, that's a great place to start. That's episode 245. It's at redpodcast.com/245. It's right after Jeff had signed the contract for this book. This episode, I check in with Jeff right after the manuscript. He's done. What are his hopes for the book? Has the contract gone according to plan? You're going to find out as I take you back in time to right after Jeff had completed his manuscript for the Free-Time Formula. Jeff Sanders is back in the Red Room. Well, not really, doing this remotely. 8 months since I had you here last. And at that time, you had just signed the book deal that you said you would never sign again. You had big hopes and dreams for it. 8 months later, you signed the deal. And kind of then what happened? Kind of give me the update, the developments since I last talked to you.
Signed the deal, and then probably about 6 weeks into that, we had lots and lots of discussions about the topic. It took a little while to kind of nail down what the book was going to be about. So we got the topic nailed down in about 6 weeks, and then we went into the title discussion, like figuring out what these title and subtitle would be for the book.
Let me stop you right there. Let's go back into the topic.
Okay.
Because you are a guy who gets stuff done. Let's just put it that way. You're a productivity guy. You're a time management guy. So they kind of knew that you were going to be talking about that topic.
Yes.
But there was a specific, I guess, niche within that they wanted to go for, or an angle?
Yeah, so they originally pitched me with the idea of doing a book with them, so I would discuss time management, and which is fine. That's what I do. So the question really was like, what about time management will I discuss? And the way they approached it to me was like, well, we're going to talk to a general audience, and so it's going to be kind of a generic time management splash. And so figuring out what that means is because I don't really tend to do general stuff. I like to be specific with what I'm teaching. So it was like, well, how do I take the generic nature of what the audience they want to reach, but be able to discuss something that's of value and that has like a real point to it? And so that was our discussion, was figuring out what about time management would be the topic. And so I threw out lots of ideas to them. They turned down all of them. So we had lots of back and forth.
Do you remember the ideas that you threw out to them?
Well, I was throwing at them everything from like a business angle to even like a podcasting angle to health and fitness. Like I had lots of different things that like I've discussed over the years that I am interested in, I'm passionate about. But they thought that almost all of my ideas I pitched to them, they thought were too niche. And so they wanted me to have a broader net. And so that was figuring out how do I discuss a topic that affects most people, but that still has its own kind of vibe to it.
Yeah.
And that's where free time kind of came in as that topic as we discussed more of it. And that took a while to get to, but that was ultimately what we chose.
So in some ways that's a niche, but it's also something that we all have. We all have free time and we want to make the most of it.
Yeah, exactly. I think that was the angle that they liked the most, because they really thought, like, even my editor was like, that's an issue that affects me, and I'm not one of your members of your audience, so like it's going to affect more people. And I at first did not like the idea at all. Like I thought it was too shallow. I was not into it. Like I really thought it was like, this is not the angle I want to go for. But so we had to discuss that topic for a while before I was on board with it. But once we had that topic kind of nailed down, then it was I could see the potential for it and see how it could kind of tie into the rest of my brand. And once I had that connection, then I was totally on board at that point.
Well, in the in-between time, though, was there a moment when you were thinking, oh, man, I've made a horrible mistake. I should not have done this deal?
Initially, I think my biggest question was, like, who are these people? Like, who is this publisher? How do they operate? Because I don't know them. I didn't know them. I knew some people who had done books with them. And so I talked to them, got some feedback, and generally it was all positive. And so it was really hard to say no to anything specific because nothing had really happened yet. We were really just kind of starting the process and like beginning that relationship. And it took a few months for me to kind of realize like how they operate, how fast they respond to emails, like what their perspective is on book sales. And so probably 2 months into it, I began to really realize like this is a good fit. So my first initial questions was just like, is this going to like long term, once the book is out and it's selling, like, will this have been a good decision or not? And I had nothing to go off of that was saying it was a bad idea initially. There was nothing at all there. So I just kept going until I would find something bad. But luckily at this point, nothing has. So good to go.
Well, do you feel that if you had to do this again, maybe you would have a different approach? Or is there any way you could have even known that you would have had to have done this before you actually signed and dived in with them? Could you have done the research without signing the deal?
Yeah, I think I could have. And one thing that I didn't do that would have been more helpful would have been to reach out to other authors from the same publisher prior to the book, or prior to the deal being signed. Because a lot of other authors have emailed me about my first publisher, asking my experience before they signed their deal. And I realized, like, oh, wait, that I should have done the exact same thing with more depth. Now, I didn't do that ultimately, I think in part because the publisher itself is a larger publisher. They're more respected in general. I've heard of them before. So it wasn't this question of, are they just an unknown brand? Like, people know the brand. And so it's not like I'm walking into, a desert island here. It's a real company that does a lot of book sales. So in that sense, it was like, is there anything just like that I would think is a deal breaker? And I couldn't find anything initially. The contract itself seemed legit, so I had nothing initially to go off of that would say it would be bad.
So you've got the overall topic, you've got the specific niche, which is free time, and that's the name of the book, the Free-Time Formula. I'm curious about the outline, and did you have to go through this process again and again for like subheadings, for chapter titles, for every little thing within the book?
In terms of working with them, there was basically no oversight, no back and forth, nothing at all. It was on me completely to do all that myself, which was a shock to me, partly because I thought there'd be more of that. But that's exactly what happened with my first publisher as well. It was the same experience where I was basically on my own to make those choices myself, to pick my chapters, my subheadings, everything in the book. It was all the content was on me.
Okay, so let me make sure I'm understanding this right. So you've got the title and the topic.
Yes.
And they give you a word count, and they say, go for it.
Yeah, basically that was it. They said, here's the deadline, here's the word count. We have a title nailed down. They did say, like, if you want to turn in some chapters for feedback, you can. But there was no specific, like, turn in half the book by this date kind of thing. And on paper that was there. Like, in the contract, it said that I had to turn in half of the manuscript by a certain date, but my editor said, don't worry about it. We're not going to look at it anyway unless you want us to. And so it was really just like, if I wanted feedback, I could ask for it. But the way that I operate, I'm a pretty autonomous guy. I just didn't really care to get a lot of feedback from them unless it was going to be a very involved process the whole way through. So once I knew, like, I had, a tighter time frame to work with, I didn't want to open that can of worms unless I thought that I could definitely do a thorough editing process the entire way. And I knew that wasn't going to be possible with our shorter time frame, so I basically just opted out of it and just said, I hope it works out in the end.
Well, see, I see what you're saying in that if you open up the can of worms and they want to change something and you're maybe a quarter of the way through, but at the same time, it sounds like you experienced what I would call a free-range book, where they just threw you out in space. There's nothing attaching you to the space station or to anything else, and you're just kind of floating. And that seems kind of scary to me, to possibly go to them with 100% of the book and then have that conversation. Were you worried about that?
Yes and no. I think that mostly I was not concerned about it because of the guidelines they had given me. There was nothing in my book that was basically like opposing those guidelines. Like, I was given a lot of autonomy to do what I wanted to do. And so as long as my book was not going to insult people or not going to, like, violate some sort of weird guideline, basically I could do what I wanted. And so knowing that, like, I had that leverage to then discuss these topics like I wanted to. And so I expected there to be feedback after the book was turned in. Like, I expected there to be an editing process at that point to say, like, oh, this third chapter is terrible, take it out. But that also did not happen. So it was just my fears initially was just like, will they accept the book in concept as a whole work, or will they kind of pick it apart and tell me it's terrible? And ultimately it worked out, but there was that sense of fear for sure.
Regarding your autonomy, I'm curious about that because you were coming into this after having another successful book on a different publisher. You're well known for your podcast. You're known for other things that you do. Do you feel that you had more autonomy than maybe other authors that would be getting a first-time book deal with a publisher? Tell me more about the autonomy and how much control you actually had of this entire process.
Well, it's interesting because the first publisher, I was given autonomy on the content, but that's basically where it ended. After that, they did everything else as far as graphic design and publication and dates. I basically had no feedback that I was able to give on the first book. So this next publisher, once I had turned the book in, then it became a back and forth conversation about everything. So I was heavily involved in the cover design process and all of the editing phases and all of the the index in the back, like everything that was a part of it. Like I've been able to give feedback and my own opinion and with a lot of stuff. And I've changed a lot of things, which has been awesome because for the most part, they've done the heavy lifting on the back end and I've just given them feedback on things to change.
Okay.
And so that process for me has been beautiful because that's kind of what I wanted in a publisher, was for them to do the things that I don't want to do. And then I can just kind of tweak the things I want to tweak. So the overall process, I've had autonomy in terms of content, and then I've had some input in terms of the kind of post-production as well. But overall, like the words in the book primarily are mine, which I like, but looking back at it, I wish I would have had less autonomy because I wish there would have been a longer writing process with a back and forth editing to make sure the book was going to be better, because the way it is now, I'm very confident it could be better, but it would have taken probably a whole extra year of doing back and forth editing to really perfect that.
And right now it took, what, about 6 months?
Yeah, the whole thing from contract signing to turning the first draft was 6 months. And I did the majority of the writing in about 3 months. That process of 3 months of writing could have been 9 months or a year easily if we had done a lot of editing in that process.
Well, tell me about getting it all done, because you are the time management guy. You are a guy with a reputation of getting up at the crack of dawn and actually accomplishing things during your day. Was that how it happened? Because, I mean, 6 months in the middle of I'm in the middle of a book myself, and 6 months, it seems like it's a long time, but there's a lot that goes into a book.
There is. And I knew initially that 6 months was going to be a tight squeeze, primarily because at the time they pitched me, I had so much going on that it was this kind of like, oh no moment. Like I need to figure out how to wrap up what I'm currently doing just to make space for a book. It took me a couple of months to do that. The fact that it took longer to nail down the topic and the title actually worked to my favor because I didn't have the time to work on the book anyway. So once I did have the time, then it was basically, I told myself, like, this is my number one priority from now until the due date, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to make sure it gets done. And so it was my number one goal. Everything else was canceled, postponed, moved around, which ironically became content in the book itself, as I discussed in terms of, my approach to getting this book done is a very similar approach to how I want to approach all my projects and how, I teach that in the content of the book. Like, this is how you could actually move through your own goals. Part of that process for me was saying, not only is this my number one priority, but I'm going to, wake up early. I'm going to go to the library. I'm going to sit in my butt in the chair and write for 4 to 6 hours until I've done my chunk for the day. And then I'll stop. And then the next day, go back and do it all over again. And that lasted for 8, 9, 10 weeks before I finally got the book done.
So that was your daily process. Wake up, 8 a.m., 10 a.m., you're at the library and you stay there until those hours are done?
Yeah, basically, that was it. I actually worked at a university in Nashville that my wife was a student at before, and so I had her Wi-Fi password. And so I was able to go and kind of, make myself a little chair in that corner of the library. And even though I'm not a student there, I was able to kind of have a nice little place to work. And it was phenomenal because the idea of just being in one place for a set amount of time and saying, I've got 4 hours to do as much as I possibly can, that was a great way to approach the book because I was able to focus and really execute and get a lot done. And at the end of the 4 hours, I was already tired and burned out, so ready to end the day. Those kind of 4 to 5 hour chunks of time became my go-to rhythm to make sure that each and every day I would get back and do some more writing until the whole thing was finished.
We talked about the length of the book. They gave you a length that they wanted this book to be, a word count. I'm interested to know if you actually wrote more than the length that they were looking for because maybe you didn't like the words. Was there some self-editing even though they weren't doing editing during the process?
I'm kind of the master of self-editing. Like, I cut my own content constantly. And so I was doing lots of that on my own, which is partly why I was also okay with having more autonomy, because I knew that if I didn't like a section, I was going to cut it and redo it. And that was basically what I did the whole way through. So my final word count I turned in was exactly what they asked for, because I was just really making sure that that was the number I was going to hit by the end. And then kind of expecting them to cut stuff and me having to write more to make the count later on. Ultimately, it worked out okay. The numbers ended up being fine. But as I began to write the book and do my own editing, I was always working towards that next word count goal. So if I had a 4 hour block of time to write, generally that was, by the end of this 4 hours, I need to write another 1,000 words, another 1,500 words, whatever it was. And so that wasn't my goal every time. And that included whatever I edited myself out and had to rewrite more stuff. So some of those sessions were very brutal and others were easier. Every day was a new challenge in itself.
So you've got word count, you've got a deadline coming up. I'm curious, though, what's your definition of, I know that this is done?
Ooh, it's a good question. Partly, I think I will go back through what I've written and read it out loud. And I find that that's really helpful. I mean, as a podcaster myself, like audio to me is where I get my thoughts out of my head. Like when I'm speaking out loud, things are more solidified to me. And so when I would read my writing out loud, I could hear mistakes, I could hear like problems, I could hear things I missed. And so that to me was a way to say like, okay, let's go back and fix this section because it doesn't flow smoothly. And in part thinking, I'm going to record an audiobook of this later on and read this thing out loud for real. So it needs to sound fluid. And so part of me was trying to make that experience happen as I was doing my writing. And so that was how I could get to the end of a section and know, okay, now I'm finished because this thing feels like it flows. It feels like it's going somewhere. It's a gut feeling. It's not objective. It's just my own kind of subjective opinion. But if I could finish a section and feel like I can read this out loud and it sounds fluid and coherent and helpful, then I was good from there.
Are you doing an audio version of this?
That's the plan. I have not yet set the date for that, but that's happening sometime soon.
But you'll voice it, and I'm curious, are you also publishing it, or was that part of the deal as well?
They have the audio rights, so I'll do the recording, but they will publish it through Audible.
So you signed the deal, you had the manuscript to them within 6 months, and then a few months after that, there's the launch date. How is that launch date selected?
That's a great question. I don't actually know the answer. I know that we had discussed the launch process early on in the contract, and they basically had told me that after I turned in the manuscript that there would be somewhere between 6 and 12 months to wiggle with in terms of their production schedule to make sure that my book fit into the kind of their production flow with other similar books to make sure there wasn't too many at once. And so that was part of it. The other part of it was the fact that my book is productivity related. And so kind of the new year time frame fits well. And so they were trying to figure out when does that happen. And ultimately, they kind of chose the date. And I saw it on Amazon before I saw it anywhere else. It's like, here's the book, here's the date it's being published. I was like, oh, there it is, which is kind of fascinating that I wasn't told all the details up front. A lot of them I had to ask for, which I think is a pretty common thing in publishing, which personally annoys me, but it's just, I feel like it's just part of the industry. That's been my experience thus far, is that there are some things you'll be told up front. A lot of it, though, you'll have to either ask yourself or just find out after the fact, which, as a control freak, I'm not a fan of, but ultimately it's fine.
Yeah, I think you have to be your own advocate. It could be a medical procedure that you're going to get. It could be a book publishing deal. It could be really anything, but you can't assume that people are going to tell you. And a lot of times, I understand that. I think with publisher, you got these heavy-handed authors that the book is their baby and they've worked on it for years and years and they don't want to get involved with that. But sometimes I think they can take it too far as well. So there's definitely a fine line to walk. It sounds like you've walked it pretty well, though.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those cases where like I've had to kind of tell myself to calm down and like not try to control every bit of the process, because part of it is like I want them to control part of it so I can not have to do that work myself. The other part of it is like I still want to be in the know as much as possible because I can use that information to, plan my launch or make things happen. But I think most of it is like I just like to have my hands in everything. And so if I'm not, it just kind of annoys me personally. But ultimately, I think that, as long as I was doing the things I was required to do well, I was fine with it. It's just it's taken me kind of my own personal journey to kind of let go of those kind of things.
Given what you've experienced over the last few months, who would you recommend to go through this process, and who would you recommend maybe to self-publish or look at some other option to get his book out?
Well, that's a good question. I think that it depends on what your goal is with your book. I know that with my first book was published with another publisher as well, that they did a good job with distribution. The book was translated into multiple foreign languages. So a traditional publisher has some advantages to kind of making things happen on a bigger scale, but you lose autonomy in a lot of ways, like I just discussed. And so if you ultimately want to control every bit of the process, choose your own graphic designer, really launch the book on your own time frame, tied in with your own other products and services, you have so much more control if you do it yourself and all of those aspects. My first book, I tried to insert a lot of URLs into the book because I wanted people to go back to my website at various places, and they removed all of those because they didn't want me to be so kind of marketing and pitchy in the book. But like I view publishing and book publishing especially as just one other kind of aspect of an integrated system of my business. And so to me, the book doesn't have to stand alone. It could be part of a bigger system, and I want that to be the case. But publishers view a book as an independent product that may or may not be tied to anything at all. And so it's kind of hard to draw that line. So if you go with a traditional publisher, you have to kind of play the game the book stands alone, versus if you self-publish, you can do whatever you want. And I think that in the future, I may consider that option with a bigger kind of product launch or a bigger system I'm developing, because I like the control of that. And so debating what to do really is a question of like, how much of this do you want to do yourself? What is the end goal of the book? How does it play into your entire business model? Because once that is decided, it's pretty easy from there to decide which one to do.
For somebody who wants to get more done, free time or not, you can get more done anytime with the information in this book. You've got a website. It's freetimeformulabook.com. And I think this is a great example for somebody who wants to do a book, whether it be self-published, whether it be through a major publisher, because this is an opportunity kind of related to what you just said. These publishers, they're looking at their books as an independent product. You're putting this in as part of a bigger picture that you're developing. Products, podcasting, other books. And freetimeformulabook.com allows people who have gotten this individual product to come into your world and see that you offer more than just this individual book.
Yeah, exactly. And also I was able to integrate another component into the book with a link to my bonuses. And so that's kind of part of that bigger business system, is being able to say, okay, you've got the book. Now you can go to the specific URL. You can get access to additional bonuses. And then from there, you're kind of into my business, system at that point. And you can get access to other products or services or just know what I'm doing. And I feel like that's kind of the integration that I wanted. So that is in the book. It's just not as tight as I wanted it to be ultimately. But the product there, it does exist in terms of here's the book, here are the links, here's the bonuses, and the whole thing works from there.
Anything that I didn't ask you that I should have?
Good question. I don't know of anything specific you didn't ask. I think it's really just a question of, if you're going to do a book, like what is the best way to approach doing it, which maybe is a question of which publisher to choose. But I think that when I approached this whole topic, this is interesting too, the publisher approached me with a topic and said, hey, we want you to write on this topic. Like I didn't ultimately choose this book. They chose it for me and asked me to do it. And which is different than the last book, but I felt like that one was, me discussing a topic that I've wanted to write about for a long time. This one just kind of came out of nowhere, and I had to kind of craft a book that didn't exist in my head prior to the contract. And so I felt more like a hired hand than just kind of an author who has another book idea, which is a bizarre way to approach it. Ultimately, it worked out great, but it was like a mental switch for me to figure out how to kind of make that happen in a way that still speaks to my own brand that I'm developing and the direction I want to go with my business. And so that angle to me was very interesting, and one that in the future, like I'm okay with doing again, but I still have to ask that question, like, will this next kind of big chunk of my life serve me long term, or is it just me kind of doing a job for somebody else? And I think it's a really kind of bizarre line to walk there, but one that in this case definitely worked out well.
Yeah, I think that even when it comes to time management, we have to look at these things. We have all sorts of opportunities coming toward us, things that are going to progress us and things that are going to regress us or just get us caught up in busy work that isn't necessarily going to be helpful for us. And I think that's something to be said. So I think that's great advice. I also want to make a comment, though, that the reason this publisher came to you is because of your podcast. It's because of the work that you're doing. And when you can be in that position, it makes negotiating deals and it makes this autonomy that we've been talking about, getting that in place so much easier.
Well, it's certainly true. I mean, both of my book deals came because I had a presence online, like because I had a podcast and because I was creating content all the time. I've been building a personal brand and business brand for years. And I think that's what allowed these things to happen. And so because of that, like I do have some sort of leverage there to say like I'm building something here. And if a publisher wants to kind of join in that process, it just kind of serves both of us well in that sense, as long as there's a good partnership there. And I feel like in this case, it definitely worked out well.
We've heard the beginning of the story right after you signed your deal, what you were thinking when you were getting into it. This is the middle, that sticky middle. You're done with the book now, excited about it coming out. And on the next episode, going to have Jeff return after the book is out. We're going to talk about how things went, the good, the bad, and the ugly of releasing a book. Jeff, thanks for being here on Red Podcast.
Hey, thank you, David. A lot of fun today.
There you have it, part 2 of the 3-part series. If you missed the first one, that was redpodcast.com/245, right after Jeff had signed the contract for this book. Coming up next, Red Podcast 247. The book is done. The book is now released. Going to talk about launching this book. That is up next on Red Podcast. To make sure that you don't miss it, subscribe. Go to redpodcast.com. Look in the top left corner. I've got links there for you. However you get your podcast, I've got a link for you. Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music. You want an iPhone app? Got it. Android app? I got it. Old school RSS? I've got it. Redpodcast.com, top left corner. Subscribe and never miss an episode. On the next one, we're talking about Jeff's launch. I'll see you then.
You've been listening to Red Podcast. Never miss an episode. Subscribe now with your iPhone, Android, or via RSS at redpodcast.com.